They'll claim words like equality. They'll claim words like Christianity. They'll claim words like freedom to choose. Those all sound really good. The problem is they're actually condoning negative and sinful behavior. The Equality Act is anything but equality. It's really a solution looking for a problem. It's also regulating what religious beliefs you should have. Look, the government is always imposing a moral point of view. It's impossible not to impose a moral point of view because all laws impose a moral point of view. The question is, which moral point of view is it going to impose? In this case, it's imposing a viewpoint that says that anyone who agrees with natural law values, those people are going to be ostracized. Those people are not going to have the same rights as people who disagree with them in the workplace have. That's not equality, that's inequality.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Now, if we look back over the past 4 years, you might remember that Trump and most conservatives were criticized for their religious beliefs. Christianity was basically labeled by a lot of big news outlets as being an extremist viewpoint. It was even used, for example, to criticize Amy Coney Barrett when she was being nominated as a Supreme Court justice. And now there's a 180 in this narrative. And here to talk to us about why this is Dr. Frank Turek with Summit Ministries. And Dr. Frank, real pleasure having you on.
Josh, great being with you. Thanks so much.
All right, so tell us what's going on here. You know, again, we saw this criticism of Trump conservatives. You might remember that when Amy Coney Barrett was being nominated as Supreme Court justice, her faith was being used as a point to say that she couldn't be, impartial. They're portraying her as radical. Now it's 180. Biden's being propped up, and they're talking about his religious beliefs and how great it is. What's really going on here?
I think what's going on here, Josh, is the left realizes that if it's going to maintain power in 2022, it's got to bring Christians on board to have them vote for the Democrats. And the problem is that, as you know, in the midterm elections, normally the party in power gets slaughtered. They've got to convince Christians now to go to the polls and vote for Democrats. What they're trying to say is, look, Joe Biden's he's Catholic. You ought to trust him. The problem is that Joe Biden really doesn't believe much of what the Catholic Church teaches, particularly on one of the most important issues of all. In fact, in my view, it is the most important issue. There can't be a more important issue than life, because the right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. And yet Joe Biden disagrees with the Catholic Church and disagrees with Scripture and, of course, disagrees with natural law on the fact that life should be protected. He not only wants to maintain abortion as the law of the land in the country, he wants the government to fund it. So he is very much extreme, and that's why they're trying to get people to say, well, Joe Biden, he's a good Catholic. Why don't you just trust him?
I saw some news articles, though, on the left, mainstream media, and they're saying that abortion now is something supported by the Bible. Have you seen these articles, and what's your take on this?
Yeah, they use obscure passages in the Old Testament, like Numbers 5 or something, which has absolutely nothing to do with abortion. It is true, Josh, to a certain extent. The Bible doesn't explicitly talk about abortion for two reasons. Number one, it was unthinkable to the Hebrews. The Hebrews considered children to be a blessing from God. And number two, it's covered by thou shalt not murder. So you don't need another command to not kill children in the womb. It was already covered by thou shalt not murder. So it's really a stretch to try and have the Bible show that abortion's okay, because according to the Bible, it's not.
Actually, you mentioned thou shalt not murder. I know it's translated a lot of times as thou shalt not kill, but I've heard different scholars mention that in the real translation, it's actually closer to thou shalt not murder. Can you explain the difference in this?
Yes, because killing is sometimes justified. For example, in self-defense, it's justified, or in a just war, it's justified, or in capital punishment, it's justified. By the Scripture, it says that God gave the power to government to use the sword to protect innocent people from evil, and that includes capital punishment. In fact, when Pilate said to Jesus, don't you know I have the authority to kill you? And Jesus said, you do, but you get that power from above. So there are instances where killing is justified, but there's no instance where murder is justified. And obviously, the taking of an innocent human being in the womb is not justified. It's murder.
Now, one thing you mentioned is that Biden doesn't really practice Christianity, Catholicism, as most Catholics and Christians would interpret it. What's the basis for this?
Well, I mean, he goes to church, but, you can go to church and not really believe or do what the church wants you to do. And Jesus famously said that there's going to be people who say, "Oh, we knew you, Lord." And he's going to say, "Well, but I never knew you because you're not following. You're not doing what I commanded you to do." Now, Christians believe we're saved by faith or saved by grace through faith, but we should do good works as a result of our faith. And if somebody at the very top of the food chain here in America is saying that it's okay to kill your children in the womb and it's okay to have the government pay for it, I submit to you that person is not following the Christian worldview. He's not following the Catholic worldview. He's not following the scriptures, and he's not following natural law.
Now, the other big part of this is the politicizing of religion, because that was the big criticism you had from a lot of the mainstream news outlets, a lot of political pundits and so on, was that Trump was politicizing religion and so on because people were talking about his faith. Mm-hmm. And really, go back, there were a lot of attacks on him based on that. Now the tables have turned and they are the ones politicizing it. How is this whole thing working? What's the shift in narrative that they're using to justify this, have you seen?
Well, the shift in narrative is that Biden doesn't actually implement what the church teaches. And he doesn't, by the way, Josh, as you know, he doesn't need to implement some sort of religious point of view. It's not just a religious point of view, thou shalt not murder. He's not trying to legislate religion. He's trying to legislate morality, and all laws try and legislate morality. The problem for Biden is that he won't even legislate the right morality, the morality that's self-evident, the morality that our founders said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice they list life first because, as I mentioned earlier, it's the right to all other rights. Without life, you've got nothing. So whether or not Biden is using his religion to bring forth the proper laws in America isn't really the issue. He's not even bringing forth the proper morality, the proper natural law morality, and he's not trying to put the proper morality into our country. He's doing the opposite. He's allowing people to kill other people, and that's obviously immoral.
This ties into a bigger picture of what I heard a lot of people talking about, which is this, alleged woke Christianity, as they're calling it. And we've seen some churches become more into like social justice movements and so on. I mean, some people would say this is a good thing. What would you say on this? What is woke Christianity?
Well, woke Christianity is the idea that we have to have equal outcomes, not equal opportunities. And the Bible does not even agree with equal outcomes. In fact, believe it or not, you're not going to have equal outcomes in heaven. Jesus said for the people, he gave those talents, the parable of the talents, he gives 5, 3, and 1. And the first two, the people that have 5 and 3, they actually invest their talents. The one that had 1 talent, he hides it, he buries it. And Jesus says, that person, I'm going to take that talent away from him and give it to the one that had 10. That's not equity. That's not equality of outcome. And yet people who are Christians are trying to say, someone like Joe Biden, we've got to have equal outcome. We've never had equal outcome on earth in any society. We're not going to have equal outcome in heaven. We're not going to have equity in heaven. We're going to have justice. We're going to have people getting what they deserve. I don't see this woke Christianity as being biblical or even practical. In fact, to quote Thomas Sowell, he said, do you know that out of the 29 Apollo astronauts, Josh, 22 of them were either firstborn or only born children? And he said, firstborn children, for some reason, do better than second or thirdborn children. And he said, if you're not going to get equal outcomes from people brought up in the same homes, how are you going to expect to get equal outcomes in our society among people who are brought up in different homes? You are not. Yet the government is supposed to equalize outcomes? No, that's not biblical. It's not practical, and it's never happened in the history of the world, and it's not going to even happen in heaven.
This is an important point as well. That's, because this new Equality Act and similar programs to it, I understand that they're being promoted by different politicians as creating equality, but a lot of people are criticizing them based on the idea that they're basically discriminating against religious belief and moral belief, where you're only allowed to have one religious belief or moral belief under these systems, reinterpreting justice in a way that a lot of people feel does injustice against the groups that are being targeted. How do you view this? How do you view these new policies coming out?
One of the problems with the Equality Act, Josh, is it does take away religious freedom, but I even think there is a bigger issue here because I don't want to make or I don't want to make it seem like the reason that religious people are against it is because religious people want to discriminate against people that don't think the way they do. That's not what religious freedom is all about. I do want to say this, though, that the Equality Act is anything but equality. I just think it's bad policy on its face, because what it's going to do, it's going to take, say, LGBTQ people who identify that way, and it's going to give them special protections in the workplace. And essentially what's going to happen is that a person, say John or Jane Doe, is going to be in a company with people who identify as LGBTQ. If a company, say, has to downsize for financial reasons, who are they going to let go? John or Jane Doe, or someone who's part of this new protected class who could bring a lawsuit against the company? They are going to let go John or Jane Doe because they don't have the capacity to sue their employer for discrimination, because they don't have that same Equality Act protecting them. So what this does is it makes 3% of the population superior to 97% of the population, and that's anything but equality. That's inequality. Mm-hmm. So it's a misnamed act. It's a total misnomer to say it's the Equality Act. It does exactly the opposite. In fact, let me add this one other thing, Josh. When you think about corporate America today, do you think LGBTQ people are being discriminated against? Are they having trouble getting work? Are they being fired indiscriminately? Are they the ones that don't have the power in the workplace? No, it's exactly the opposite. If you were to go into a corporate boardroom right now and say, I have an objection to same-sex marriage, but I'm going to treat the people who agree with same-sex marriage with dignity and respect, you would be kicked out of that corporate America boardroom. I know I have been. It's the people who hold traditional values that actually need protection, not the people who run corporate America. Those are the LGBTQ people. They're the darlings of corporate America, yet now we've got this Equality Act. It's really a solution looking for a problem. It's also regulating what religious beliefs you should have. Look, the government is always imposing a moral point of view. It's impossible not to impose a moral point of view because all laws impose a moral point of view. The question is, which moral point of view is it going to impose? In this case, it's imposing a viewpoint that says that anyone who agrees with natural law values, Christian values, even we might say Muslim values when it comes to sex and sexual behavior, those people are going to be ostracized. Those people are not going to have the same rights as people who disagree with them in the workplace have. That's not equality, that's inequality.
Now, how does this tie to this issue of when Christians try to speak out about their faith, they're told that they're getting involved in politics, basically, and told to kind of, sit down and be quiet and go back to your church and don't speak outside the church. Whereas now we see this woke Christianity being allowed to speak. How does this whole thing work kind of when it comes to the political system behind it?
When it comes to the media will allow you to express what you say are your Christian views if they disagree with traditional Christian views, if they disagree with Orthodox Christian views. That's why Biden's views on abortion are just fine. They're Catholic views according to them, because Biden doesn't actually agree with the Catholic Church, right? If you agree with the left and you claim you're religious, you're all in. That's great. But if you claim the traditional views, or if you claim what Jesus actually taught, you're out. You're canceled.
This new ascendant view of Christianity, what is this whole idea coming out?
Well, it's the ascendant view of liberal Christianity, the Joe Biden view, that somehow the scriptures teach us that abortion is okay and any sexual behavior is okay and the traditional family isn't necessary and transgenderism ought to be the norm. These things aren't biblical. They're not even natural law. But if we label it Christianity, we can maybe get people to swallow this poison pill. You see, the left is really good as coming as an angel of light. They'll claim words like equality. They'll claim words like Christianity. They'll claim words like freedom to choose. By the way, who can be against freedom to choose? Those all sound really good. The problem is they're actually condoning negative and sinful behavior.
Now, we spoke a bit about the kind of founding views of this country, the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence protecting free speech, freedom of belief, and so on. And, one thing that's, I think, misconstrued, and I've heard explained to me a few times, and it's very interesting, is why people fled to the United States, that the pilgrims were being persecuted for their religion. And they came here really to escape religious persecution and created a system of government meant to safeguard the ability to have free religion. I mean, what's your understanding of this whole founding story of America in this regard?
That's why they did not want to have a federal government that condoned a federal church or mandated membership in a federal church government. Not many people know this, but it's interesting that 5 out of the 13 colonies, when they became states in 1791, when they actually signed the Bill of Rights, which included the First Amendment, 5 of the 13 states had their own state churches. They just didn't want a federal government to have a church that everybody needed to be a part of. If 5 of the 13 states had their own state churches, they realized the First Amendment did not have a hard separation between church and state. Now, eventually, the churches or the states eventually disestablished their churches. I think Massachusetts was the last one to do so in about 1833. But they didn't think that the church couldn't influence the government. They didn't want the government to influence the church. That's really what that was Jefferson's one-way wall of separation when he wrote to the Danbury Baptist in 1803. He wasn't saying there was no interaction between the state and the church. He wanted the church to influence the state. He didn't want the state to influence the church. Isn't it interesting, Josh, with all these COVID lockdowns, the state has almost taken draconian methods to stop the church. In fact, I saw you had an interview recently with that Korean pastor out there in California. I think he was maybe in Pasadena, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
He came out of North Korea.
Cheon, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a fascinating interview. Here's this guy who comes from North Korea. His father was actually a pastor in prison in North Korea, if I remember the interview correctly. And he comes to America and he starts a church here in California. And now you've got Governor Newsom and other officials in California threatening to lock him up if he holds a church service and to fine every one of his members $1,000 for every time they come to church. Well, that's nothing that Jefferson ever would have condoned. It's nothing any of the founding fathers would have condoned. We have freedom of religion in this country. No governor has the authority to shut down a church service, and yet that's what we're seeing here in America.
Now, you mentioned something important, which was Jefferson's letter, and just for our audience, it's important to note, there's nothing really written in, say, traditional American law that forbids separation of church and state. The interpretation that was taken from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson, and that was basically, long story short, there was nothing in the U.S. Constitution about this. Actually, it's in the Soviet Constitution, which was adopted much later into the kind of interpretation in American law, post, really not that long ago. Could you explain this to us? What did Jefferson really say, and how did this idea of separation of church and state really develop?
Well, it actually developed from a 1947 Supreme Court case called Everson versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court justices quoted Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, which he wrote in 1803, because the Danbury Baptists were worried that maybe the federal government was going to start a state church. Jefferson said, no, we don't want that. And I want basically a one-way wall of separation between church and state. I want the church to influence the government, but I don't want the government to influence the church. It's a misplaced quote for the Supreme Court in 1947 to quote Jefferson, who had nothing to do with writing the Constitution. Jefferson was the ambassador to France in 1791 when the Bill of Rights were ratified. If you want to know what the First Amendment meant to the founders, you need to read James Madison, not Thomas Jefferson, because James Madison is the one that put most of that together. He's the architect of our Constitution. So to quote Thomas Jefferson 12 years later when he was president, when he writes a letter to the Danbury Baptist, that's not the way to get back to the Constitution anyway. The church could influence the state, but he didn't want the state to influence the church. And we can't forget the second half of the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. When a governor says to a pastor, you can't hold a church service, he's prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and that's illegitimate. That's a violation of the United States Constitution.
And this is an important discussion, too, because as you mentioned, religious views do inform law. Pretty much all of history is rooted in a moral standpoint based in one religion or another. And if you remove the idea of religion from law, it throws a wrench into the entire interpretation of morality within the country, which is the basis of law. I'm curious your interpretation of how this affected things going forward, because we did see a huge shift, really a really progressive shift in America taking place after about 1950, shortly after this change was made.
Yes, the problem is that we are pulling out the foundation of morality when we remove God from our government. Now, interestingly, I would argue that the United States Constitution was not founded on Christianity. It was founded on the natural law consistent with Christianity. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And isn't it ironic, Josh? I don't know if you can remember back this far. I don't know how old you are, but back in the Clarence Thomas hearings, Joe Biden was on the Judiciary Committee, and he was making fun, basically, of Clarence Thomas for believing in natural law, not realizing, perhaps, that natural law is the foundation of the United States of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's natural law. I mean, it comes from the same source, God, as the Bible comes from, but you don't need to cite the Bible to know basic right and wrong. You don't need to cite the Bible to know that you ought not murder innocent people. You already know it because it's written on your heart, as even the Apostle Paul said himself in Romans chapter 2. So we already know right from wrong on the basic issues from natural law, and that's the foundation of our country, and that's why Jefferson and Madison and the other founding fathers did not want to have a national religion, but they knew that we needed to base this government on theism and allow religious freedom, but also have the foundational values that we get from having God, from believing in God. Without God, there are no rights, there are no wrongs, everything's a matter of opinion, and they knew that.
As you mentioned, too, that we've seen this shift in different countries. The biggest example being communist regimes that are atheist by nature, and where when you remove the idea of God or religion or belief or natural law from the equation, right or wrong basically becomes determined by government action. This is where political correctness comes from, 1967 Mao Zedong, where government action becomes the basis of morality. And if they say that killing your landlord or killing off a certain religious group is the righteous thing to do for the common good, then that becomes the basis of morality, and even questioning of it is what's deemed as immoral. I'm curious what your understanding of this is.
No, I agree with you 100%. It's whoever has the most power wins if there's no God. If there's nobody above the government, Josh, whatever the government says or does suddenly becomes your moral obligation by that kind of logic. And quite obviously, that's not the case, because if there is no standard beyond humanity, everything's a matter of opinion. You wouldn't be able to say Mao was wrong, or Hitler was wrong, or Stalin was wrong, unless there's a standard beyond all of them to which we're obligated to obey. And so God is the ground of morality. Without him, there are no rights and there are no wrongs. And of course, in our hearts, we know there are real rights and there are real wrongs. So we should reason back to the fact that God does exist. And if our government does wrong, we ought to protest against it and try and vote for what's right.
Now, when it comes to a lot of people who are, I say, either side of the spectrum with this, I think there are different layers of concerns. I think people on the left point to the Catholic Church and the Inquisition. They say, well, this is what happens when, a moral authority is able to basically persecute people for going against the interpretations of behavior. Basic behavior. And of course, a lot of people on the other side point to, of course, as we just mentioned, atheist regimes under communism, where they say morality becomes basically whatever the government says it is, and you often see massive atrocities. The most murderous regimes in human history took place under communism.
Yes.
But it seems that the American system, and this is often overlooked, gave a lot of ground to personal morality and personal belief. I think broke away from what happened with the Catholic Church, as well as away from, and really this is why the Cold War was fought, away from these really radical socialist regimes that swept the world from the last 100 years. How would you interpret this American interpretation as it relates to these two other systems?
Well, I would say that you don't judge a philosophy or a religion by its abuse. You judge it by what it says it believes in. Christianity would never believe in the Inquisition. On the other hand, you could see how people could use atheism to justify the Holocaust or justify what Stalin did or what Mao did. Because as you just mentioned, Josh, if that person is God, if there's no God beyond them, who's to say they're right or wrong? You see, the Inquisition was the illogical outworking of Christianity. Genocide could be considered the logical outworking of atheism because there is no moral constraint outside the system. I don't judge Christianity by the Inquisition. Christ never would have condoned the Inquisition. But if there's nobody beyond us, if there's no God, if there is no standard of righteousness or justice beyond us, then whatever the person in power does can't be considered right or wrong. It just is what it is.
And I think this ties back to what we were discussing earlier, the understanding the quality, the value of human life and appreciating the value of human life. Whereas if we understand collectivist system, it's the value of the common good, which sometimes requires the killing of a human life as they interpret it, like abortion, as you mentioned, and like genocides, like we saw under communist and socialist systems, where destroying one part of society was basically justified under the narrative of the common good. When you deal with collective politics, common good, versus systems of traditional morality, which looked at protecting the individual rights, the individual and protecting their own rights and their own, say, unique traits was the focus rather than public interest and common good. I'm curious what your thoughts are about this dynamic of common good versus, let's say, individual rights.
Well, I think the reason we see that is because on atheism, the individual dies, the state is eternal. In Christianity, it's the opposite. The individual is eternal and the state dies. The state is going to go away because at one point the universe is going to end. So what's eternal are human beings, not the state in Christianity. In atheism, in Marxism, in communism, the state is eternal. So if we have to kill some of these individuals in order to keep the state moving forward, that's what we will do. That's the main problem right there. The state is everything. And we know that that's not really true. That's not really the case. In fact, my friend Rod Dreher has written a book called Live Not by Lies. I don't know if you've heard of that book, but Rod Dreher interviewed Soviet dissidents who have since come to America. And he realized that these dissidents were saying all that totalitarianism that was going on over in the Soviet Union, we're seeing it coming here in America. And we need to wake the American people up because it's coming here. Now, it's not coming as much from government. It's more coming from culture and corporate America, that this totalitarianism, you don't see it our way, we're going to crush you, we're going to cancel you. That's coming here. And so we ought not live by lies. And that quote, by the way, comes from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, when he left Russia, he was kicked out of Russia for being a dissident in 1974. He told his citizens, stop living by lies. The communists are trying to get you to live by lies. Don't do it. We're seeing it here in America, Josh. We're being told there are no genders. We're supposed to live by lies. We're being told that an unborn child in the womb is not a human being. That's a lie. We're told to live by lies. We're being told that any sexual behavior is just as good as any other. That's a lie, and we all know it. We're told to live by lies. We can't live by lies anymore. We have to stand up for the truth. That's why I'm thankful for your program.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned something interesting, too. You said corporate America is the real force pushing this. And I mean, this is ironic because I think a lot of people, like even democratic socialists, tend to oppose big business, although we do see it's mostly big corporations and big business working with politicians to push these same policies under the narrative that somehow it's challenging their power. And I think a lot of people have trouble putting two and two together on why that is. You know, why are these big corporations pushing this?
Well, they're largely run by leftists in the HR department. That's why I mentioned before, the Equality Act is totally unnecessary. The people that are advantaged in corporate America are the LGBTQ citizens. It's not Jane and John Doe. It's the LGBTQ citizens because they're running corporate America. I mean, we just saw last week, Coca-Cola came out talking about the race issue. Be less white. What does that mean? Be less white? How could you be any more racist than that? Imagine if they said be less black. What is that supposed to mean? I mean, it's just, you don't end racism with more racism. But that's what they're trying to do. So we're being asked to live by lies, Josh. Unless people stand up and say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, it's just going to continue.
You were mentioning Solzhenitsyn, and actually a quote he had really kind of stood out to me, which is he said something interesting. He says during the early days of the revolution in Russia, when he talked to older people and why this happened, they said it's because we forgot God. That's why this happened.
Yes. And
he said that after seeing everything, after studying books, after going through everything, if someone were to ask him why this happened, he said it could be summed up in one statement. He said, we forgot God, that's why this happened. What's your understanding of that? It seems to be the trajectory right now of this country as well.
I think if you combine what Solzhenitsyn said, we've forgotten God, and you take Lord Acton's dictum, which said absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, you see the problem. Because when people get the God complex, that they are the ones that get to make the rules, they get to make right and wrong, then you get the kind of damage that we see to our society. You get people who are ostracized. You get people who are killed unjustly. You get people who are canceled unjustly. I mean, think about this, Josh. You know how long the church has been viewed negatively because of heresy trials, these kinds of things. Of course, that's justifiable criticism there. But the left will cancel you without a trial. They don't even care what you do. What they care about is what you say. You could have been Mother Teresa for your entire life. And suddenly, if you say one wrong, politically incorrect thing, you're done. You're toast. You're canceled. There is no trial. You're a heretic. It's over. I mean, this is madness. And unless Christians and other people of like-mindedness who value freedom stand up, it's just going to continue. The only way to stop bullying is to stop the bully.
I spoke to some people recently about the way communism works, which is it goes into this whole idea of the dialectic, where they basically do an extreme viewpoint, they challenge it, and they want you to meet them halfway. And every time you meet them halfway, you lose half the battle, essentially. And
That's right.
A lot of people say the only way you can stop this is just by stop engaging with their narratives, stop engaging with the dialectic, as they call it, and say, I'm not going to move from where I'm at. Mm-hmm. I guess just last question here. Again, you're obviously outspoken. You're not afraid to speak about these issues. I assume you've been attacked quite a bit for it. If you were to tell people one thing about why you've taken this stance, and I guess what it's like to put yourself in that position, what would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them, as a Christian, you're going to be persecuted. And even if you're not a Christian, but you express moral law values consistent with Christianity, you're going to be persecuted. Jesus said, look, if they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. And Paul said, anyone who lives a faithful life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So number one, you got to expect it. Number two, I agree with what my friend Rod Dreher says in his book, Live Not by Lies. We have to assemble ourselves into small groups, because this is how Christians and other like-minded people survived the Iron Curtain. Before the Iron Curtain fell, they got engaged in small groups so they could support one another when they were canceled or when they were persecuted. If someone in your small group loses his or her job because of their being canceled, that group has to come around them and help them financially, and then help them find another job or employ them directly. So I think that we need to do that moving forward, because that's what's going to go on here. We still need to stand for truth because we care about our fellow citizens, even people that don't agree with us. We care about freedom. We want what's best for them. And once freedom goes away, everything else falls with it. We're not going to be able to live lives that are prosperous. We're not going to be able to live lives that are free. We're not going to flourish like we should if we don't have freedom. So we have to stand up for freedom.
Hey, Dr. Frank Turek, a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Great being with you, Josh. Thanks for the work you're doing.